Hey everybody, this is the sixth and final video of Adorno's Negative Dialectics, Part 3, Chapter 1. Part 3 is titled Models. Chapter 1 of Part 3 is titled Freedom on the Metacritique of Practical Reason. And the sections in this video are Kant's, quote, intelligible character, intelligibility and the unity of consciousness, truth content of the doctrine of intelligibility. So let's party. Kant's, quote, intelligible character, end quote. The construction of the intelligible character is Kant's way to connect existence with the moral law. The construction leans upon the thesis that, quote, the moral law proves its reality, end quote, as if things that are given, things that exist, were legitimized by being given and existent. When Kant says further, quote, that even outside the world of the senses, in freedom, the determining ground of this causality may be assumed as a quality of an intelligible being, end quote. The concept of equality turns the intelligible being into a full-fledged, quote, real one that can be positively conceived in the life of the individual. Yet this, within the axiomatics of non-contradictoriness, runs counter to the doctrine that intelligibility is beyond the world of the senses. Kant promptly and frankly recalls that doctrine. Quote, the moral good, on the other hand, is supersensory so far as the object is concerned. Accordingly, nothing that corresponds to it, end quote. And thus, most certainly, no, quote, quality, quote, can be found in any sense perception, and the power of judgment under laws of pure practical reason seems therefore to be subject to special difficulties, resting upon the fact that a law of freedom is to be applied to actions as events which occur in the sensory world and thus belong to nature, end quote. Kant. In keeping with the spirit of the critiques, the passage is directed not only against the ontology of good and evil as noumenal properties, stringently criticized in the Critique of Practical Reason. It also goes against the coordinated subjective faculty, which is removed from the realm of phenomena, is said to assure that ontology, and bears a character of a downright supernatural sort. Objectively, one of the strongest motives behind Kant's attempt to save freedom by introducing the doctrine of the intelligible character, an utterly exposed out on a limb doctrine, resisting experience and yet conceived as a link to empiricism, was that the being of the will could not be inferred from phenomena, could not be defined by their conceptual synthesis either, but had to be presupposed as their condition, with the same drawbacks of a naive realism of inwardness which Kant, in other cases of psychological hypostasis, destroyed in his chapter on paralogisms. The precarious linkage is to be accomplished by proving that character is neither exhausted in nature nor absolutely transcendent to it, as its concept implies dialectically, by the way. Yet motivations without which there would be no such linkage have a psychological element, while the motivations of the human will, according to Kant, can, quote, never be anything other than the moral law, end quote. This is what the antinomy prescribes for each possible answer. Kant elaborates it bluntly, quote, for how a law might immediately and by itself be a determining ground of the will, which is, after all, the essential factor in all morality. This is a problem insoluble for human reason, and as one with the problem how there might be a free will. What we shall thus have to show a priori is not the ground on which the moral law in itself constitutes a mainspring. It is what, supposing the law is such a mainspring, it will bring about. One had better say must bring about in the human mind, end quote. Kant's speculation falls silent where it ought to start. He is resigned to simply describing imminent effective contexts. Contexts which, had his purpose not overwhelmed him, he would not have hesitated to call delusive. Something empirical acquires a supra-empirical authority by stealth, by the strength of the affection it exerts. Kant deals with a, quote, intelligible existence, end quote, that exists without time, although, according to Kant, time has a part in constituting existence, and he treats it without being deterred by the contradictio in adjecto, without articulating it dialectically, indeed without saying what, if anything, one might conceive under that sort of existence. He goes farthest in discussing, quote, the spontaneity of the subject as a thing in itself, end quote, a spontaneity of which, according to the Critique of Pure Reason, one could no more talk positively than of the transcendent causes of external sense phenomena. On the other hand, without an intelligible character, there could be no moral action in the empirical realm, no intervention in that realm, and thus no morality. Kant has to strive desperately for something prevented by the layout of his system. What helps him is that reason can intervene against the causal automatism of both physical and psychological nature. That it can create a new nexus. In the finished philosophy of morals, he deigns to stop thinking of the intelligible realm, now secularized into pure practical reason, as absolutely different in view of that discoverable influx of reason. However, this is by no means the miracle it would seem to be according to the abstract interrelation of Kant's basic theses. The prehistory of reason, that it is a moment of nature and yet something else, has become the immanent definition of reason. It is natural as the psychological force split off for purposes of self-preservation. Once split off and contrasted with nature, it also becomes nature's otherness. But if that dialectics irrepressibly turns reason into the absolute antithesis of nature, if the nature and reason itself is forgotten, reason will be self-preservation running wild and will regress to nature. It is only as reflection upon that self-preservation that reason will be above nature. No interpretive art would be able to remove the contradictions immanent in the definitions of the intelligible character. Kant does not say what it is and how, on its own, it influences the empirical character. He does not tell us whether it is to be simply the pure act of positing the empirical character or whether it is to go on beside it, a possibility that sounds sophisticated but is not quite implausible for our self-experience. He is content to describe that influence as it appears in the empirical realm. If we conceive the intelligible character wholly, some word in Greek, as the word suggests, we cannot discuss it at all, no more than we can discuss the thing in itself, with which Kant cryptically equates the intelligible character in an utterly formal analogy, not even explaining whether it is, quote, a thing in itself, one in every person, the unknown cause of inner sense phenomena, or whether, as Kant says occasionally, it is, quote, the thing in itself, identical with all the rest, like Fichte's absolute I. There's a footnote here that I missed. Shit. A convenient rebuke to the concept of intelligibility is that mentioning unknown causes of phenomena positively, even in extreme abstraction, is forbidden. A concept of which simply nothing can be said is not the one to operate with. It would equal nothing, and nothing would be its proper substance. This was one of the most effective arguments used against Kant by the German idealists, who wasted little time on Kant's and Leibniz's idea of the boundary concept. Against Fichte and Hegel's plausible critique of Kant, we have to remonstrate, however. This critique follows the traditional logic which prohibits as idle the discussion of whatever cannot be reduced to substantive contents which make out the substance of the concept in question. In their rebellion against Kant, the overzealous idealists forgot the principle they had been following against Kant, that consistent thinking forces us to construe concepts without any positively and definably given representative. For speculation's sake, they denounced Kant as a speculator. They were guilty of the same positivism of which they accused him. What survives in Kant, in the alleged mistake of his apologia for the thing in itself, the mistake which the logic of consistency from Maimon on could so triumphantly demonstrate, is the memory of the element, subject to causality. Of the element. Which balks at that logic, the memory of non-identity. This is why Kant, who surely did not misconceive the consistency of his critics, protested against them and would rather convict himself of dogmatism than absolute identity, from whose meaning, as Hegel was quick to recognize, the reference to something non-identical is inalienable. The construction of thing in itself an intelligible character is that of a what the hell is going on here? One second, sorry. It's a footnote, but the footnote seems like it just cuts off. That is fucking weird. Weird! It doesn't look like there's any pages missing. And it looks like also like that footnote, when I said that I missed it, it looks like that footnote actually starts on the following page, so I don't know. End footnote. In exerting influence, such a radically severed subject would become a moment of the phenomenal world and subjected to its definitions, including causality. Kant, the traditional logician, should never permit one and the same concept to be both subject and not subject to causality. And see, that's where the footnote seems like it's supposed to go. Yet if the intelligible character were no longer some word in Greek, it would no longer be intelligible either. In the sense of Kantian dualism, it would be contaminated by the mundus sensibilis, and equally self-contradictory. Wherever Kant feels obliged to elaborate on the doctrine of the intelligible character, Kant must, on the one hand, base it on an act in time, on something empirical of the sort it is flatly supposed not to be, and on the other hand, he must neglect the psychology he gets embroiled in. Quote, there are cases of people who from childhood on, even with an education that benefited others at the same time, show such early malice and keep increasing it so in adulthood that one takes them for born villains utterly incorrigible in their way of thinking, and yet their acts and omissions will be equally judged, their crimes equally censored as guilt, and even these censors deemed by themselves, the children, as well founded as if, regardless of the hopeless natural disposition meted out to them, they remain just as responsible as any other human being. This could not happen if we did not presume that whatever springs from man's license, as every intentional act undoubtedly does, rests upon a free causality whose character, from early youth on, is expressed in its phenomena, the acts. These acts, by uniformity of conduct, indicate a natural context, but that context does not necessitate the will's ill nature. It follows, rather, from the voluntary assumption of the evil and immutable principles which make it only more reprehensible and more deserving of punishment. End quote. Kant does not consider that the moral verdict on psychopaths might err. The allegedly free causality is relocated in early childhood, a most fitting shift, by the way, for the genesis of the superego. But it is foolish to attest to babies, whose reason is only just forming, the same autonomy that is attached to full-fledged reason. As moral responsibility is backdated from the adult's individual action to the dawn of its prehistory, an immoral pedagogical justice is administered to the underage in the name of their being of age. The processes which in the first years of life decide about the formation of ego and superego, or as in the Kantian paradigm about the failure of this formation, can evidently not be credited with a priority because of their priority in time, nor can we ascribe to their highly empirical content that purity which Kant's doctrine requires of the moral law. In his enthusiasm for the punishment deserved by infantile villains, he leaves the intelligible realm only to cause mischief in the empirical realm. New section. Intelligibility and the unity of consciousness. Despite the ascetic reticence of Kant's theory, what he was thinking of when he conceived the intelligible character is not beyond conjecture. It was the unity of the person, the equivalent of the epistemological unity of self-consciousness. The backstage expectation of the Kantian system is that the supreme concept of practical philosophy will coincide with the supreme concept of theoretical philosophy, with the ego principle that makes for theoretical unity and tames and integrates the human drives in practice. The unity of the person is the stage of the doctrine of intelligibility, in the architecture of form-content dualism which runs through Kant's thinking. That unity is counted among the forms. In a dialectics that was unintended and remained unexplained until Hegel, the principle of particularization is a universal. In honor of universality, Kant draws a terminological line between personality and the person. He calls personality, quote, the freedom and independence of the mechanism of nature as a whole, but viewed simultaneously as a power of a creature subject to peculiar, pure, practical laws given by its own reason. In case of the person as part of the world of the senses, this means a creature subject to its own personality, insofar as this belongs to the intelligible world at the same time. End quote. Personality, the subject is pure reason, as the suffix "ity," the index of a conceptual universal, signifies, is to subjugate the person, the subject, as an empirical, natural, individual creature. What Kant meant by, quote, intelligible character, end quote, was probably quite close to, quote, personality, end quote, according to an older linguistic usage where it, quote, belongs to the intelligible world, end quote. Factual psychological contents of consciousness are the premises, not only of the genesis, but of the sheer possibility of the unity of self-consciousness. This unity marks a zone of indifference between pure reason and spatial temporal experience. That facts of consciousness would not exist without being determined in a single consciousness, not in some other picked at random, was glossed over in Hume's critique of the ego. Kant corrects this, but neglects the reciprocity. In criticizing Hume, he lets personality congeal to a principle beyond the individual persons to their framework. Kant conceives the unity of consciousness to be independent of any experience. There is a measure of such independence with respect to single changing facts of consciousness, but not a radical independence of the existence of such facts, of there being any factual contents of consciousness whatsoever. Kant's Platonism, in Phaedo, the soul was something similar to the idea, is an epistemological echo of the eminently bourgeois affirmation of personal unity in itself, at the expense of its substance, an affirmation which ultimately left the name of personality to no one but the, quote, strong man, end quote. The rank of the good is usurped by the formal achievement of integration, but this achievement is a priori anything but formal. It is substantial, the sedimented control of man's inner nature. The suggestion is that regardless of the dubiety of, quote, being oneself, end quote, the more of personality one is, the better he must be. Great 18th century novelists had their suspicions about that. Fielding's Tom Jones, the foundling, a, quote, instinctual character, end quote, in the psychological sense, stands for the individual unmaimed by conventions and properly turns comical. In Ionesco's Rhinoceros, we heard the latest echo, the only man who demonstrates a strong ego by resisting the bestial standardization is an alcoholic and a failure at his trade. According to his life's verdict, his ego is not all that strong. One might ask, despite Kant's example of the radically evil infant, whether an evil intelligible character would have been thinkable for him, whether evil to him did not lie in the fact that the formal unity miscarried. Where that unity does not exist at all, Kant would presumably talk no more of either good or evil than among the animals. Most likely he conceived the intelligible character as a strong ego in rational control of all its impulses, the kind taught in the whole tradition of modern rationalism, notably by Leibniz and Spinoza, who found here, at least, a point they could agree upon. Footnote: concerning the relationship between Kant's doctrine of will and that of Leibniz and Spinoza, see Johann Edward Erdmann's book Geschichte der Neueren Philosophie, published in 1932. End footnote. Great philosophy is set against the idea of a man not modeled after the reality principle, a man not set in himself. This put Kant's cogitative strategy at an advantage. The thesis of freedom can be carried through in a course parallel to that of consistent causality. In the Kantian system, the unity of the person appears as a formal a priori, but it is not that alone, against Kant's will, but favoring his demonstrandum. It is a moment of the subject's very content. It is a moment of the subject's every content. Each of an individual's impulses is, quote, his impulse, just as he has a subject as the totality of these impulses, unless their qualitative otherness. In the utterly formal region of self-consciousness, the line is blurred. What can be predicated of this region, but not discriminated, is that which does not mutually exhaust each other, the factual content and the mediation, its connective principle. It is in the indifferent concept of, quote, personality that extreme abstraction helps to vindicate a fact tabooed by traditional logic and its mode of argument, but only the more real in dialectics. The fact that in our antagonistic world, the individuals are antagonistic in themselves as well, that they are both free and unfree. In the night of indifference, a glimmer of light falls on freedom as the noumenal personality, a Protestant kind of inwardness that is removed even from itself. The subject, according to Schiller's apothegm, is justified by what it is, not by what it does, as the Lutheran of yore was justified by faith, not by works. The involuntary irrationality of the Kantian intelligible character, the undefinability forced upon it by the system, is a tacit secularization of the explicit theological doctrine of the irrationality of election by grace. Conserved in progressive enlightenment, of course, this election becomes more and more oppressive. Once Kantian ethics had, so to speak, relegated God to the serving role of a postulate of practical reason, another thing forecast in Leibniz and even in Descartes, it was difficult to conceive the intelligible character, which irrationally is the way it is, as anything but the same blind fate to which the idea of freedom takes exception. The concept of character has always oscillated between nature and freedom. The more ruthlessly we equate the subject's absolute being this way with its subjectivity, the more impenetrable is the concept of that subjectivity. What once upon a time seemed to be election by grace, a divine decree, is scarcely conceived anymore as an election by objective reason, which would have to appeal to subjective reason after all. Man's pure noumenality, devoid of any empirical substance, and sought in nothing but his own rationality, does not permit us to make any rational judgment about why it worked in one case and failed in the next. The authority, however, to which the intelligible character is tied, pure reason, is itself evolving and thus qualified, not absolutely qualifying. The idea of positing outside of time as an absolute, an anticipation of the same Fichte with whom Kant was feuding, was far more irrational than the doctrine of creation had ever been. It made an essential contribution to the alliance between the idea of freedom and real unfreedom. Irreducibly existent, the intelligible character is a conceptual duplication of that second nature in which society casts the characters of all its members anyway. Translated into judgments about people, real people, Kantian ethics knows but one criterion: how a man happens to be so is his unfreedom. The primary intent of Schiller's apothegm surely was to manifest the disgust evoked by the subjection of all human circumstances to the barter principle, the evaluation of one act by comparison with another. Kant's moral philosophy announces the same motif in contrasting dignity with price. Yet in society as it ought to be, barter would be not only abolished, but fulfilled. No man would be shortchanged about the yield of his labor. I'm going to copy that down. One second. Boom, boom, boom. Sorry. Oh well. Sorry about that. There is no way to weigh an isolated action, and neither is there a good that is not externalized in action. An absolute state of mind, devoid of all specific interventions, would be bound to deteriorate to absolute indifference, to inhumanity. Objectively, Kant and Schiller both are preluding the odious concept of a freely suspended nobility, which self-appointed elites can later attest to themselves at will, as their own quality. Lurking in Kantian ethics is a tendency to sabotage it. In that ethics, the totality of man comes to be indistinguishable from pre-established election. There is something sinister about the end of casuistic inquiry into the right and wrong of an action. It marks a transfer of jurisdiction to the compulsions of empirical society, which the Kantian, some word in Greek, sought to transcend. The categories, quote, noble and, quote, mean, like all categories of the bourgeois doctrine of freedom, are intertwined with conditions of family and nature. Their natural origin breaks through once more in late bourgeois society as biologism and eventually as racism. Under existing circumstances, the reconciliation of morality and nature as envisioned by Schiller against Kant and secretly in accord with him is not so thoroughly humane and innocent as the philosophizing poet knew it to be. Nature, once equipped with meaning, substitutes itself for the possibility that was the aim of the intelligible character's construction. In Goethe's Kalokagattia, the ultimate murderous turnabout is unmistakable. We have a letter written by Kant about a portrait of himself by a Jewish painter. In this letter, he was already resorting to a maliciously anti-Semitic thesis later popularized by a Nazi, Paul Schulze Naumburg. Footnote, quote, heartfelt thanks, my most highly esteemed and beloved friend, for the disclosure of your kind sentiments toward me. Duly received, along with your beautiful gift on the day after my birthday. The portrait that was done without my consent by Herr Löwe, a Jewish painter, is indeed said by my friends to bear some degree of resemblance to me, but a connoisseur of painting said at the first glance, a Jew will always paint another Jew by tracing the nose as he does. But enough of that, end quote. Kant. End footnote. Freedom is really delimited by society, not only from outside but in itself. We no sooner put it to use than we increase our unfreedom. The deputy of better things is always also an accomplice of worse ones. Even where men are most likely to feel free from society in the strength of their ego, they are society's agents at the same time. The ego principle is implanted in them by society, and society rewards that principle although it curbs it. Kant's ethics was not yet aware of this dilemma, or else he was passing it by. New section. Truth content of the doctrine of intelligibility. If one dared to accord its true substance to the Kantian X of the intelligible character, the substance that will stand up against the total indeterminacy of the apparetical concept, it would probably be the historically most advanced point-like, flaring, swiftly extinguished consciousness inhabited by the impulse to do right. It is the concrete intermittent anticipation of the possibility, neither alien to mankind nor identical with mankind. Men are not only the substrates of psychology, for they are not exhausted by the objectified control of nature which they projected back upon themselves from outward nature. They are things in themselves insofar as they are no more than they have made. To this extent, the world of phenomena is truly a semblance. Hence, the pure will of Kant's foundation is not so very different from the intelligible character. There is a verse by Karl Kraus, quote, "What has the world made of us?" end quote, in which that will is pensively pondered. It is falsified by anyone who believes it to be in his possession. Negatively, it breaks through in the subject's painful perception that in their reality, in what became of them, all men are mutilated. What would be different, the unperverted essence, is withheld from a language that bears the stigmata of existence. There was a time when theologians would speak of the, quote, mystical name, end quote. But the separation of the intelligible character from the empirical is experienced in the eons-old block that shuts off from the pure will, from the addendum, external and considerations of every conceivable sort, manifold subaltern irrational concerns of the subjects in a false society. In general, the principle of particular private interest, which in society as it is prescribes his action to every individual, bar none, and which is the death of all. Inwardly, the block is extended in tendencies of obtuse egotism, and then in the neuroses. These, as we know, absorb an immense quantity of available human strength, acting on the line of least resistance and with the cunning of the unconscious. They prevent that right action which inevitably runs counter to hidebound self-preservation. And the neuroses have so much easier a time of it, are so much easier to rationalize as the self-preserving principle in a state of unfreedom would be just as entitled to its due than would the interest of others, which it a priori interferes with. Neuroses are pillars of society. Neuroses thwart the better potential of men, and thus the objectively better condition which men might bring about. There are instincts spurring men beyond the false condition, but the neuroses tend to dam up these instincts, to push them back toward narcissistic self-gratification in the false condition. Weakness that will mistake itself for strength, if possible, is a hinge in the machinery of evil. In the end, the intelligible character would be the paralyzed rational will, the part of it that is considered higher. On the other hand, the part deemed more sublime, unmarred by meanness, is essentially its own inadequacy, its inability to change the causes of its humiliation. It is denial stylized as an end in itself. And yet among men there is nothing better than that character, the possibility to be another than one is, even though all are locked up in themselves and thus locked away even from themselves. The striking defeat in Kant's doctrine, the elusive abstract side of the intelligible character, has a touch of the truth of the anti-image ban, which post-Kantian philosophers, including Marx, extended to all concepts of positivity. Like freedom, the intelligible character as a subjective possibility is a thing that comes to be, not a thing that is. It would be a betrayal to incorporate it in existence by description, even by the most cautious description. In the right conditions, as in the Jewish theologumenon, all things would differ only a little from the way they are, but not even the least can be conceived now as it would be then. Despite this, we cannot discuss the intelligible character as hovering abstractly, impotently above things in being. We can talk of it only insofar as it keeps arising in reality, in the guilty context of things as they are, brought about by that context. The contradiction of freedom and determinism is not, as Kant's understanding of his critiques would have it, a contradiction between two theoretical positions, dogmatism and skepticism. It is a contradiction in the subject's way of experience themselves. Subject's way to experience themselves, as now free, now unfree. Under the aspect of freedom, they are unidentical with themselves, because the subject is not a subject yet, and it is not yet being a subject, and its not yet being a subject is due precisely to its instauration as a subject. The self is what is inhuman. Freedom and intelligible character are akin to identity and non-identity, but we cannot clearly and distinctly enter them on one side or the other. The subjects are free after the Kantian model insofar as they are aware of and identical with themselves, and then again they are unfree in such identity insofar as they are subjected to and will perpetuate its compulsion. They are unfree as diffuse, non-identical nature, and yet, as that nature, they are free because their overpowering impulse, the subject's non-identity with itself is nothing else, will also rid them of identity's coercive character. Personality is the caricature of freedom. The basis of the aporia is that truth beyond compulsory identity would not be the downright otherness of that compulsion. Rather, it would be conveyed by the compulsion. In the socialized society, no individual is capable of the morality that is a social demand, but would be a reality only in a free society. The only social morality that remains would be at last to finish off the bad infinity, the vicious system of compensatory barter. But the individual is left with no more than the morality for which Kantian ethics, which accords affection, not respect to animals, can muster only disdain, to try to live so that one may believe himself to have been a good animal. Okay, and that is the end of chapter 1 of part 3 of Adorno's Negative Dialectics. Part 3 is called Models, or was called Models, and chapter 1 is titled Freedom on the Metacritique of Practical Reason. Thank you so much for listening.